And good afternoon. I'm Ian Simon. I earned my PhD in virology from Yale University. And right after my doctorate, I transitioned into science policy, first with an overseas fellowship in South Korea. And then back here domestically after that, I was a American Society for Microbiology Congressional Science Policy Fellow. I worked for a year in the Senate and then 2 years as a AAAS Executive Branch Fellow at the State Department before coming to my current position at the Science and Technology Policy Institute. And as Alexa said, we are a nonprofit but federally funded research and development center that supports many of the executive branch agencies that have a science-focused mission, as well as the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. And my current portfolio is around biosecurity, biodefense, infectious disease preparedness, as well as other broader issues like STEM education and the entire science and technology enterprise for the country.
Very good and very impressive, guys. Thank you for sharing a little bit about yourself. I just wanted to ask you, Ian, since you had the mic last, what inspired you to get into a career in science policy? Can you cover a little bit about the why, the impact, the importance of your work?
Sure. So I guess to do that, I'll have to go all the way back to when I was in graduate school. I was about halfway through, so about year 2.5 to 3. And I found myself getting a little bit disillusioned with the what I saw were the career trajectories of folks that I worked with, postdocs, young PIs, where they spent so much of their time writing grants and dealing with budgets and not really at the bench doing science. And I started thinking about other kinds of career paths besides just becoming a PI. And that's when I explored a whole range of different options and kind of found myself stumbling towards the student government and just kind of extracurriculars where I enjoyed spending my time. And I found where my efforts around trying to impact and improve the lives of the 5,000 students that comprise the graduate school there at Yale University, found that much more rewarding than kind of the day-to-day moving a tiny amount of liquid from one tube to another and writing a paper that maybe 12 people would ever read. So it was that combined with then I went to a career panel and saw one of the alumni who had done one of these science policy fellowships and realized that there are opportunities and there are career paths for people who can take their love of science and match it with keen interest in policy and legislation and government works. And once I learned about that, I was set on my path.
And Alexis, you're a chemical engineer by training. Are there a lot of engineers in making transitions into science policy as well? How did you sort of make that decision? Walk us through your career decision making in your head.
Sure. In fact, I probably dating myself a little. My PhD was awarded, in 2005, I believe. So I would say there's a lot more engineers going into science policy now than there were at that time, right? And we're seeing the emergence of a lot of really great academic PhD programs that are combining different aspects of engineering and science policy, which I think is wonderful. And I honestly didn't know was even an option when I was working on my PhD. The way that I got into science policy was I kind of fell backwards into it a little bit. So I mentioned I started out in corporate R&D. I finished up my PhD very sure that I did not want to be an academic and I really wanted to go into corporate research and development, develop the next cool technologies that were going to change the world, but from a private industry side. And it was only after I started to do research on the technology that was then used to inform an EPA regulation and had that opportunity to interact with the EPA and see how they were using data and science to inform the regulations and the policies that were affecting everybody in the industry that I was in, that I really started to catch that bug. Then one other kind of additional note that really sealed it was once I actually started at the EPA, the first opportunity that I had to take a technical analysis that I'd done and brief it up through high-level EPA leadership, and they made a policy decision based on the analysis that I'd done. After that point, I was hooked.
Nice. And Calais, you were the most recent entrant into science policy. I was there when you were making decisions about the AAAS fellowship, and I
You
remember
were
us having
there.
conversations. Can you tell us how you landed on the fellowship, coming from a lab that was focused more on health disparities?
So actually, I had during graduate school, I had thoughts of pursuing careers away from the bench, and I just wasn't entirely sure what that meant or what that looked like. And so at I think it was my first time attending the, I think it was ABRCAMS, it was an annual biomedical research conference for minority students, and there was a table at that conference for AAAS, and so that was kind of my first introduction into that type of fellowship. And around the time that I was set to defend and considering what type of postdocs I wanted to, because I still wasn't fully convinced yet. So I was like, okay, I should take a postdoc, but I need to be forthcoming during my interview and express that my interests are kind of shifting towards policy. And that was what kind of helped push me along prior to meeting you, Roshni. And then once I joined, Dr. Evans's lab, of course, I worked really hard at the bench, but I also had opportunities to, like, for example, I completed detail at the National Institute on Minority Health and Health Disparities. I also served in like our science policy discussion group as like the regional chair. I volunteered at a nonprofit here in Baltimore. I was also a mentor to high school students, and so pretty much didn't say no to anything, and still beasted it out. And here I am today.
Yeah, I remember you saying yes to a lot of things, which obviously led to you sort of exploring various paths. So each of you have said that informational interviews, you fell into it, or you started exploring these paths a couple of years before you actually transitioned. Ian, you're actually sitting in your office right now dealing with coronavirus stuff. So can you tell me a little bit about what your day-to-day work looks like?
Now?
Yeah, now, or when and calmer times.
Let's go with calmer times.
Okay.
Moving forward. The way that I like to describe it is that, well, it's hard to describe a typical day. It's easier to describe a typical month, because one day might be very different, but in the span of an entire month, my energies are focused on three primary kinds of things, and one is researching and actually kind of doing the science policy research, getting into primary literature, getting into policy briefs, government reports, sometimes legislation, and actually kind of like mining the written word for information, for data. Sometimes it's informational interviews where I'm mining other subject matter experts. So I'd say a third of my time is spent doing that. A third of my time is spent in meetings. And these can be meetings where we have our internal research teams and we're meeting amongst ourselves to share the work we're doing, update, work through different kinds of problems and challenges, dividing up labor in terms of who's going to do what part of the research project. And then there are meetings externally where we have to, once we have an interim finding or conclusion, we need to deliver that in a meeting. Or if we reach a sticking point, we'll meet with the government official or agency that asked us to do the work, and we'll explain that. So that's the meeting part. And then I'd say a third of my time is writing. So after the research, you got to write it up. And the writing takes many different forms. It can be, I spend a lot of my time actually writing emails, but like well-crafted emails for targeted reasons to the right folks. Then there's where you're still communicating information and emails. Then there's short memos, 2 to 5 pages, or all the way up to writing very big reports that are hundreds of pages long. So it's research, it's meetings face-to-face, and that's writing, communicating in written form.
Actually, yeah, go ahead.
And I'd say now it's completely, it's very different. I'd say it's been about half my week in in the offices of the Office of Science, Technology, Policy, working with the rest of the folks there that are working on coronavirus efforts. And so I'll work half the time from in the office, half the time from home. And so, and that is a lot of, I think it's a lot more of, because everybody's sort of on Zoom, it's a lot more calls and things like that than normal.
Yeah, so you hinted at you need to employ a lot of your writing communication skills. So the question from one of the students was, what is something, either a skill or anything in general, that you wish you'd known before you'd worked in science policy? Like, what skills would you have benefited from gaining in grad school or postdoc that you could have used in these careers? And I'll start with Alexis first. Any particular skill sets? Obviously, you have to be a good writer, a communicator. You should be able to network, write memos, analyze data. What else are the essential skills that I should brush up as maybe a third-year graduate student thinking about getting into science policy?
Sure. So I would highlight two things, and interestingly enough, I think that they both are skills that you're already naturally going to develop as part of earning a graduate degree and earning a PhD. So one is problem solving, right? So just being able to come in and think through a problem and understand what are we going to need to do next, what is 5 steps down the line, who needs to be involved. You think things like that sound very basic, but if you don't have that core skill set of being able to think through what all the pieces and parts are, especially when you're getting into policy, you're going to miss something. And then there was another one. Oh, being able to come up to speed quickly on different technical topics. So particularly if you're looking at science policy and intersection between science and technology and policy issues, as Ian does now, and I did when I was at STIPI, right? Usually you're going to end up with a really wide variety of topics that you get pulled into, especially in different fellowships and internships all over DC and in government writ large. So the ability to, when somebody hands you a new technical topic, being able to become an expert or something very close to an expert in a very short period of time, I'd say is a really important skill.
Calais and Ian sort of relates into this question. You both did fellowships. And so the question from a student was, do fellowships help people decide what type of science policy career they want to pursue? Because how do you figure your next steps after a fellowship or after graduate school? So how much does your fellowship determine you entering into the field of science policy?
Well, I wouldn't say it was the fellowship per se. It's more of being aware of the opportunity that the fellowship can allow. And so learning how to, at least for me, learning how to build relationships. And again, being very flexible to different opportunities that you typically wouldn't consider were important for me. And I knew that, like in graduate school, my interest in health disparities it was growing, but I still I'm not an epidemiologist by training. And so I knew I wanted to at least dabble on that side of things in order to, beef up my CV in that regard.
Yeah, I'll chime in and say that the fellowship is a great time or a fellowship like a AAAS fellowship, great time to learn and explore. So just learning what it's like to work in science policy, to see up close what a career might look like, or even just a regular, a job, a few years here, a few years there. And then also just kind of getting out of thinking about policy issues in any one technical area. It's a great way to branch out and think about other kinds of technical areas that you never thought of, or areas that could use technical expertise but don't seem technical on the surface. So I recently met someone in their first year fellowship who is currently working at DoD, but working on humanitarian aid. And so it's one of these things where, he never thought about, there's, science and technology solutions to how to deliver food to, the Philippines that just got hit with a typhoon and things like that. So in that way, that's one of the real valuable aspects of a science policy fellowship.
And kind of branching off on that, frankly speaking, when I was so for the fellowship, like they sent us a list of which agencies are accepting fellows. And so I had it in my mind, I already made an assumption that, okay, I know I'll probably be at like NIH or one of the, one of those agencies. But again, to Ian's point, like recognizing that my skill set is valuable to the DoD, and recognizing, for example, my interest in women's health is very important for individuals who are designing policy for active duty service women and suiting their, their health needs. Just put things in a different perspective that frankly I didn't really consider prior to being a AAAS fellow.
Okay. Alexis, I was just wondering, to add to some of the skills that you were talking about, one of the questions submitted to me was, how can we as graduate students learn to network better? Because networking is also an important skill during science policy. How do we make a better impression? How do you work on your networking? And Ian said that part of your job is also reaching out to folks and subject matter experts, asking for informational interviews. How do I get better at that is what the grad student's asking.
Absolutely. So a couple of thoughts, and then I would invite other panelists to chime in as well. So Roshni, you already mentioned the importance of communication skills and kind of being able to communicate science to a variety of different stakeholders. Well, I would say that holds true about yourself as well, like being able to talk about yourself and your background and having, it's a little cliche, but having your elevator pitch ready in terms of talking to folks and networking at different events on what you're interested in. And once they hear where you would like to go in your career, it's a lot easier for them to make connections with, hey, I know someone who's at this organization who does that type of work. And it's very interesting how often, especially in DC, connections get made that way. The other note that I would add is, get involved in your organization of choice. For me, it's the Society of Women Engineers. I've been a volunteer leader with that organization since very early in my career. I now serve on their board of directors. Thanks to everybody for the claps. And really think that whatever organization that you choose, pick one that the mission and the vision resonates with you and is important to you, and then become involved, because not only does it help you with your network, but it can also help you with those different leadership, professional development skills that you might not get in your day-to-day job, that then you have the opportunity to build as part of that network and as part of that organization.
Okay. Ian and Calais, you probably echo the same sort of sentiment. Ian, I'll let you add to that point.
So sorry, I'm losing my thought because I was reading the chat box as well. Sorry, I'd already thought about the chat. Can you remind me, what was the question of Alexis?
I was just re-emphasizing the importance of networking. We can actually move on to the question that's addressed to you.
Wait, no, I want to say something about networking.
Yeah, please. Go ahead, Calais.
And I think it's important to remember, and I may have said this already, so my apologies if I'm repeating myself.
Yeah.
But again, it's about building relationships, and so elevator pitches are nice to have, but also situational awareness. So if we're at a meeting and it's the time to approach someone that you've been, scientifically standing for a while, then yeah, go ahead and talk to them. But not just have your pitch, but also a few other questions kind of prepared. So that way you're not just awkwardly standing in their presence, hoping for the best, that they'll fill you with knowledge. And also recognize what you can contribute to that relationship, because networking, again, isn't a one-sided interaction. And so don't just, I would recommend not barraging someone with a bunch of emails, anticipating them to just give you all sorts of information and to help you plan your future. Just be actively involved in the relationships that are important for you to build.
Yeah. Ian, since you were looking at the question in the chat box, let's talk about that particular question, which is, what does the career trajectory look for someone already in science policy? Where do you guys see yourselves long term? And Ian, will start with you, and then go Calais, and then Alexis.
Sure. So I think that there are a few different trajectories. Maybe I'll touch on three that come to mind. One is sort of a staying in government kind of trajectory and working, let's say, for instance, at the Department of Energy, like my colleague here, and kind of working in the government sector, kind of working way up. There are many AAAS fellows that are now hold pretty high positions in government, and you know, were scientists just like us and did a fellowship, and next thing you know, they kind of went that way. There are others that then take the skills and experiences and kind of move into the nonprofit sector. So understanding how some of the leadership and connections and networks can lead into, you know, taking leadership roles in nonprofit or even other kinds of private sector ventures. And then a lot of folks return to academia with a few years out. They're teaching as a professor or in administration. There are a lot more universities that are really interested in the kinds of convergence ideas, converging sectors, marrying policy with different kinds of science. And so they're looking for folks that have knowledge of both. And so moving back into academia in more of an administrative or research leadership on a campus kind of level.
Uh-oh, my turn to answer.
Yeah.
So, frankly, I'm still early enough in my experience that I feel like I can do whatever I want to do, and so I don't think of it as a one-track direction. I'm just in that space where it's like I really can do whatever I want to do, and I think one of the most important questions that someone asked me during my postdoc was, "Am I interested in science for policy or policy for science?" And so that kind of helped me narrow down my focus. And so I know that in the experience that I've had, I'm more so interested in, you know, science for policy. I'm more so interested in providing objective, understandable data for people who are writing policy. And at some point, like in terms of like my portfolio at DoD, like I have, you know, been involved in editing policy for the DoD, for the Defense Health Agency, for the military health system overall. Like I've responded to reports, you know, I've edited reports to Congress. And so it's like, I don't know, whatever I want to do.
Okay. So you're saying the world is your oyster after this, and those
It is. It's a struggle.
Let me ask a question from Elma first. I'm going in order of flow. As a person that has been a student for a decade, going out to the job market can be terrifying. I know some of us have some student leadership experiences, but other than institutional committees and student government, some of us don't have more experience. What advice will you give to someone who wants to jump into science policy now?
I'm going to kind of virtually look at my other two panelists, just because my advice that I would likely give would be to look at the different internships and fellowships that exist out there in the science policy realm. That being said, I fully recognize I'm the only panelist that didn't hold one of those internships or fellowships, so I defer to them on if that's the best course.
Well, so there, I think I mentioned a couple of activities I participated in that were outside of the institution. And for example, the volunteering at there's a nonprofit here in Baltimore, and I actually heard about it while listening to the radio on my way to work. And so I just took the initiative to contact them to ask, like I sent, I think like the director of that nonprofit my CV, and I just said, hey, this is who I am. This is what I've done. How can I be of service to you? And then he didn't respond right away. And so I sent him more emails because I didn't want to be ignored. And then when he finally responded to me, he, you know, just invited me to come down and to figure out what I would enjoy doing and when I would be able to do it. And so sometimes it's, again, it's important to understand what's enjoyable for you, and then just kind of inserting yourself in situations that will allow you to use your skill set to be of benefit to the group you want to work with.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So for me, when I was still in graduate school, I was, in addition to, you know, graduate student government, I was volunteering with United Way. I was volunteering with other kinds of, you know, health-related nonprofits that were delivering services to the city of New Haven. I like the way Kelly said that she, you know, never said no. I mean, that's sort of a great way to go about rounding out experiences that would not only inform you about different kinds of aspects of science policy or science policy adjacent kind of opportunities, but then also serve as really great things to describe and communicate with a policy fellowship or even in just a regular job interview.
Yeah, and Elma, a point to note is that each of our panelists also, been students and then made that transition. And so incorporating some of the ways in which they made that transition, definitely I don't see an issue with you as well transitioning or jumping into science policy. Vivek wants to know, and Alexis, this kind of goes along with your problem solving. Is it possible to share an example of a problem that you solved, sort of highlight the challenges of that problem from a policy perspective?
Oh, good question. I think I think that sometimes the best examples are actually ones that haven't been solved yet, that are kind of policy issues that continue to be pervasive. So maybe I'll start there, if that's okay. I think that one issue that I've been involved in on and off, both in my career and then in my volunteer capacity as well, is issue around diversifying the STEM education as well as the STEM workforce. And the continued kind of underrepresentation that we see of different minority groups, be those based on race or gender or other metrics, right, in the STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, right, fields. And that's something that has been kind of an open policy question, for decades, right, at this point. And it's such an interesting one, I think, to unpack and to have had the opportunity to work on, because so much research, right, has gone into it, and so many different programs and policies, right, have come out over the years, and it's still not a nut that's cracked, right? So I think it's a good example, not because it's solved, but because it isn't solved, and it's one that we'll have to continue to work on, right, as we move forward.
I have an interesting question for you now, submitted by a student earlier, who said, how does your experience in your work change from administration to administration? And I think this is more so for Ian and Alexis, who've been in science policy for a little longer. He says that I think it's important for people to hear that for much of the rank and file in science policy, not much changes between political groups, at least those in government positions. So how does your work change from admin to admin?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. So I would generally agree with that assessment. I think it does depend a little bit on your role and the exact impacts that you see. I mean, obviously, if you're a politically appointed leadership, that might look a little bit different than it does if you're operating at the kind of science policy staff level, right? But yes, I would say that overall, like, again, just thinking about the Department of Energy, which I just joined, right? So again, renewable energy technology is something that's going to be developed and continue, right? And is important for thinking about the energy efficiency that can be gained, in the U.S. going forward. And that's not an issue that's going to go away based on an administration change.
I'd agree. I'd say one of the changes that I think most people that strike most people is the changes in how visible science is, how prominent science and technology advice or policy issues might be, and from one administration to another. I think the visibility and the level of visibility changes, but the actual work itself may not change.
Yeah. Okay. And I'm answering a private message in the chat box that asks the panelists what they learned from their PhD training, what skills they use that are most useful in their day-to-day jobs. And I think they hit upon this question already to the person asking, which was analytical skills, problem-solving skills, communication, all that stuff. So I'm just going to move on from that question. And since we're at the halfway point, I want to ask you guys, since we've learned a little bit about how you got where you got, let's get at that moment where you had your job interview and your application process. What was that first time that you applied? What was the application process? Let's talk about where you applied, and then followed by how was your interview, your first interview in a science policy job. So Ian, we'll start with you, then ask Callie about her interview experience, and then Alexis can tell us a little bit about her most recent experience. So Ian, what was that first application? Where did you apply, and did you use USAJOBS to apply for this position? No, you didn't. You didn't.
Yeah. So let's see. So there are many applications that I submitted before I actually got a job. So let's start there. So when I first tried to transition to science policy positions full-time, sort of domestically here, so not my overseas work, but domestically here, it was the fall of 2009. So the job prospects were really dire. Folks were, the economy was shedding hundreds of thousands of jobs a year. So it was very hard to even get the applications in. But when I started to get interviews, my first interview was in fact at my current institution, the Science and Technology Policy Institute, where I submitted an application. I came in for an interview where I was going to talk about a little bit of my experiences working in the field for the few months I had overseas. It was a presentation of a project that I did, and then sort of half-hour individual interviews. And I remember in one of my interviews, this sticks with me, I talked a little bit about my experience, and they said to me, okay, so let's say you have some challenging topic and you need to get up to speed quickly. How are you going to do that? And I said, oh, well, I'll go ahead and do some Google searches. And it's like, well, okay, what else would you do? And I was like, oh, I'll try to do some primary literature. I said, what else would you do? And I drew a blank. And he said, would you call anybody? And I was like, oh yeah, I called some people. And he said, who would you call? And I had no idea. Needless to say, I did not get the job. But what it did do is it showed me a little bit about how, I mentioned before, when you really need to tap into areas or subject matters that are outside of your wheelhouse, being able to reach subject matter experts, or reach into a network, is pretty valuable.
Okay, and Calais, can you tell us a little bit about your AAAS fellowship interview? I know a lot of people here are probably considering that as a next step too.
I can. And keep in mind, this was last year, so pre-pandemic. So the interview process is pretty intense. Looking back on it, it was fun. But during that process, I had 15 interviews scheduled, and I was maybe 38 weeks pregnant. And so it's pretty much traveling, DC, Maryland, Virginia, to all these different interviews. And I will say the actual questions there, the best, I really enjoy how they describe how to prepare for the interview during our orientation, during finalist week orientation, because they said that, they already know if they want you. And so the interview process it wasn't the typical interview, whereas you're trying to convince them of your worthiness, so to speak. It's more of they know you're awesome, and you're just trying to figure out which office suits your, like which would be the best situation for it to be, mutually beneficial. And so, and I also haven't interviewed for a full-time policy position yet, so hopefully I'm prepared when that time comes.
And Alexis, did you apply through the USAJOBS system because it's the Department of Energy?
I did. So I actually
Okay.
have successfully navigated the USAJOBS process twice in my career, which I think makes me somewhat of an outlier.
Yeah.
It is, again, it's kind of practical advice, right? But it is a very different system than I think any sort of private or nonprofit positions that you would apply for. It has a lot of quirks, a lot of kind of things you need to know how they operate and what's going to be done with your information on the back end and the different types of reviews it's going to go through. So I will say there's a lot of information out there about it. There's books that have been written about the USAJOBS process and how to successfully navigate it. So if you are considering putting in for a government position in USAJOBS, I would just highly encourage folks to, one, find folks who have successfully navigated started the process and learn from them. And then two, do read up on it. Again, you don't have to read a book. There's also some nice articles that have been written that summarize key points, but it really is important because I think a lot of folks go into that thinking like, hey, if I put my resume in here and I've got the right skills, that it'll, I'll sail through. And it's just, they analyze the data in a little different way than a lot of folks think. And so it's just an important point to think about as you're looking at jobs.
Yeah, absolutely. USAJOBS is a beast to tackle, and a strategy definitely involved. Let me ask a juicy question that you please don't reveal your real salary, but tell me a salary range of a PhD in science policy in their first job. And I think for Alexis at government, it's probably a GS scale. So I asked this question with the FDA folks last week as well. So that was around GS 11, GS 12. But what can I expect with a PhD or a postdoc for my first job in science policy? What kind of range am I expecting?
I mean, I'd say it varies a lot, and this is just kind of my personal experience and anecdotes from others that I know, right? So just take that for what it's worth. But I know folks who've come in fresh out of a PhD at the GS11 level, and I know some folks that have kind of successfully navigated, usually with a fellowship or something that, in addition to their PhD, that come in at, say, the GS13 level. And again, that can vary by agency, and can even vary within agency by the group that you're applying to in terms of what kind of positions they have available, and what the kind of range of GS scales is already in the group that exists. I think the important point to make for folks listening is that the GS or general schedule scale that the US government uses does not have a separate scale for folks with different types of degrees, right? So I know in particular, folks in engineering, in physical sciences and biological sciences can sometimes find that the pay in the GS schedule compared to that in private industry and other positions can be much lower in the federal government because there isn't a sliding scale typically for folks who have those degrees that are higher paying if you go out into industry or the private sector. So it's just like a note just to keep in the back of your head. Again, a lot of folks that go into the federal government are more in it for the service component than, and they're pretty good benefits too, but than the exact salary, but it's important note.
Yeah. I'm going to ask questions that the audience are dropping in the chat box. So it could be any question. A question from Lauren is, how much of your work involves science versus policy? What are some resources to keep up to date with science policy? And we'll start with Ian and then Kelly.
I'd say, how much of my work involves science? I'd say maybe 30 to 40% involves science. It's, a lot of it is kind of trying to get up to speed and understand scientific trends rather than, one particular project that happened once, but understand where science has been, a field of science has been, where is it going, how does policy affect it? So I'd say upwards of 30 to 40%. How do you stay up to date?
Yeah.
So I like to stay in tune with what the National Academies is doing, kinds of reports they're putting out. Within my particular area of biosecurity, the Johns Hopkins Security Center for Health Security is like a treasured resource that I read once or twice a day. I think they put out 2 different sort of newsletters, email newsletters a day. And so it's one of the main ways I stay abreast. The policy sections of Science and Nature are great. Make sure I keep track of those. And then I just get on other kinds of listservs from groups that I know are in the area that are sort of in the field.
Okay.
I would echo that. I'm on a lot of different listservs. And I would also say it's kind of hard for me to give you a percentage of how much of my time is spent on science, because again, a lot of the skill sets that I learned in graduate school are applicable to what I'm doing now. And I would say I'm mostly in health policy, because, I'm working with the military health system. So.
Ben and Bharat, do you guys in your Homewood Science Policy or your science policy groups, do you also sort of send out a listserv or information for how to keep updated in the field of science policy? If so, just mention it in the chat box. Robin has a question for all of you guys. You all seem to enjoy your jobs, but what do you think is the hardest? And I think I'll ask the two-part question. What's the most rewarding? And then what's the most challenging aspect of this job? Ian, let's go with you. First.
Most rewarding has to be hands down when you when you have the opportunity to think about a topic, put together analysis, make sure it's based on the best available evidence. You communicate in a way that resonates with the current policy challenge, and you see it implemented. So that's incredibly rewarding. It doesn't happen all that often, but it's just like science. You kind of, right? Most of our experimental results are not positive or don't lead to expected outcomes, but you keep trying and trying. And then I'd say the least rewarding part of the job is a combination of bureaucracy and I tell folks here that I work with some of our younger folks that a lot about science policy is based in personality. A lot of science policy is personality. A lot of policy is personality. So when personality gets in the way of good policy, it's also pretty frustrating.
I think Kale's kids have come into the picture as well.
One
right?
of them.
One of them.
So I mean, I would echo what Ian said. And like it's really cool to see your ideas come to fruition on paper. That's really cool. And I think some of the challenging aspects, so in terms of like my day-to-day responsibilities, like when I first started, like the days felt kind of slow because I didn't really know what was happening. And so I mean, that's been the most difficult part about things so far. Like when I don't know something and then trying to figure out, okay, what does this mean? Who are the stakeholders? How do I, relate to them? And just being, I don't know, mindful of like all the military personnel that I'm around, and I'm still not fully versed on like their ranks and everything. So but again, that's situational.
Mm-hmm. And Alexis?
I would say rewarding, it's a little tough for me being just a couple weeks into my position, but I would say so far rewarding for me is kind of knowing that I helped, right? So if I've contributed, if I've put some dots together, technical, policy, both, right, that are helping to further the mission of the department, to further geothermal energy, like whatever we're looking at on that day, right, then that you kind of take home and you're like, yes, even in the current environment that we're in, like I helped and I moved things forward from a policy perspective. Not into the current environment that we're in, and the fact that we're doing this panel virtually, I will say that's been the biggest challenge for me. So I 100% onboarded into my current position virtually. I have not been to my office yet in the 3 weeks that I've been on the job. I have had to introduce myself to the staff reporting to me virtually, right? And so this current environment, some folks who are 100% working remotely, some who aren't, a lot of folks who are, just kind of afraid, understandably, to be out and about. It's just a really hard environment to operate in. And I think that it's just important that we say that out loud and acknowledge it for all of our interactions. So the interactions that we have at work, things like, again, you all mentioned that folks are trying to do interviews, right? Like be understanding. You might have somebody who's interviewing you who has their, child walk through the back or their dog barks while you're, talking to them. And that's just the kind of thing that we all just have to be understanding about as we kind of move through and navigate this together. And I just wanted to give a really quick, shout out to Roshni for organizing this and putting this together in a 100% virtual way and making it work. This has been fantastic.
Thank you, and thanks for you guys for just being so quick to say yes. We have a question from Homewood Science Policy Group President Ben. Yes.
Oh, hi. I'm curious about what are some priors that you held prior, or some beliefs that you had about any sort of aspect of whether it's science policy, people, government, nonprofits, that you had before going into your current positions that you ended up later finding out weren't totally true or totally accurate, and just some possible thought process changes that you may have experienced during your time in science policy.
All right, I've got one. The lazy government worker stereotype drives me crazy. Again, having now left the federal government and come back, I will say that I have worked my butt off in every federal or quasi-federal position that I've had, and I've only ever interacted with folks who 100% have the mission of the organization in mind and are also busting their butts to make things happen. And so I don't know if it's just a dated reference that refuses to go away or what, but everyone who I've interacted with in the federal government is 100% kind of working for the American people, working for the mission. I really would like that stereotype to go
away. I'll say that I think one of the things that I've learned that my mind has shifted is that there are often no new ideas. I mean, there are ideas that have been around for decades that just haven't had either the right backing, the right circumstance, the right champion. I guess I came in thinking that there are scientists and thinkers and innovators that can plug those new ideas into government. And then you find out that those ideas are already there. They're just really hard to execute on. So I think that's the other misconception I had, is that the government is unaware of all of the great things out there. They're aware, it's just really hard to make it happen.
Thanks for that question, Ben. I have a question. Actually, anyone else have a question before I ask mine? Okay, the question I have is on behalf of international PhDs and postdocs. Obviously, when you work with government, there are certain restrictions on your visa. Do you see a lot of your colleagues, are they international at all? Are you aware of how people with different visas and passports can work in science policy in the US? It's a hard question, right?
Yeah. So I work for an organization where everyone here has to be eligible for a security clearance, which means that citizenship is a basic requirement. But that's just in my organization. I do know that there are a lot of really great folks in science policy that work in the nonprofit sector. That really the think tanks out there where they're folks with science policy experience, but who aren't U.S. citizens are doing great work.
Any final questions from the audience in the last 5 minutes? Otherwise, we'll close with, okay, we have a question from Lauren. I think we answered this question before. How much does a presidential administration affect your work? Definitely, we already answered that question. I can revisit and write you the answer later on. We have a question from Pritika who's asking, are think tanks also part of the science policy world?
I mean, so the use of the term think tank, I think, has gotten broader and broader over time. There are definitely nonprofits that do different kinds of science policy research, and they get their funding from a variety of different sources. I'm thinking of, for instance, the Hopkins Center for Health Security, where I don't think they're considered a think tank, but they're definitely a nonprofit. They're definitely doing research and putting out interesting pieces about policy surrounding health and science. And so some people might throw them under the think tank umbrella, but so there are institutions like that.
Okay.
I would just add, to Ian's point about kind of think tank can be kind of broad and a lot of different things can get thrown in there. Say if you're considering applying for a science policy position in the think tank, just do your research, right? I mean, certainly I'm sure everyone has read articles where they're like a conservative leaning think tank or a progressive leaning think tank, did such and such research, right? So just trying to look into, as Ian says, kind of where funding is coming from, the kind of research they're doing, do they have a lobbying component to what they're doing or not? Things like that will help give you an idea of what part of the science policy spectrum, I guess, that they're on, and whether or not it's kind of policy versus politics and that spectrum as well. So just do your research.
I just wanted to say that this is the first career chat that I've had that has been very all-encompassing, but also ends on time. So thank you guys for being such efficient answerers of these questions. I wanted to also thank you for your time. And Ian, you're super busy with the coronavirus response as well. So thank you for taking the time. I know you have to walk across the building now. I eavesdropped on your conversation a little earlier. Thank you everyone for reaching out. Listen guys, I need you guys to share a feedback form so we can continue to have these virtual panels in the future. Thanks, Calais. Thank you, Alexis. Thanks, Ian. Thanks for everybody for joining. I will share with you in a follow-up email the panelists' LinkedIn, and you can follow up with any questions with them as well. So thanks, everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Mm-hmm. Thank
Bye.
you, Roshni.
Calais, Ian, and Alexis, I'm about to email you because I want to send you guys a gift from my office. So I will email you and ask you how I can do that.
Okay.
Thanks. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, Alexis.
Bye.